Hey YouTube, so vibe coding's been getting really popular nowadays, and I just wanted to, play around with it myself. I had a few project ideas that I kind of came up with last weekend and this weekend, and I just wanted to kind of treat today as an informal kind of blog entry of all the things that I've tried so far, things that have worked, things that haven't worked. It'll be really cool to learn from this and move forward. Hopefully, maybe some of my ideas can inspire you on trying out some of your own home projects. Also, it'll be really cool to look at maybe 3 months from now or maybe like a year from now and see like how far the large language models have gotten, and to see how much better their code is generating compared to the code that they're generating today. So yeah, vibe coding's been super exciting, super fun. I think everyone should be trying this. It is going to change how we code definitely in the future. Right now, I think it's still got some serious limitations, but I think as the models evolve, understand better code and better coding practices, it's going to make your lives a lot easier and simpler. I think there are some key techniques to using it, at least even today. And so I just want to kind of go over some of the things that I've tried. In the comments below, if you've got other things that have been more successful than what I've seen, definitely share below. I'm definitely looking to learn. Like I said, today's video is going to be somewhat informal. I'm just going to show you kind of the projects that I've done and walk you through my thoughts and initial reactions. But who knows? Maybe you have some way better ideas. Definitely put them in the comments below. All right, so last weekend I decided to make a bio page. I've always had like my bio on LinkedIn, but I always thought it'd be cool to kind of have your own website. And I always had the domain. I just never bothered putting it together, just because I felt like it was a lot of code and effort to put together, just for very little value, because most people are using LinkedIn anyways. And so I decided to test out vibe coding, see what it can do. So this is a single page web app, no backend, no nothing, no nonsense. The navigation that happens here in the top nav bar, that's just different tabs and pages across from it. I simply used data entries from my resume and cut and paste a couple of sentences into the air, and it structured all the information. Everything you see here, I asked it to build like a modern UI. It's got some nice cool animations here for these buttons. It's pretty cool. I even decided to push the limits to having dark mode, which overall worked pretty good, I'd say. If you look here, you can see that some of these boxes and some of these components here, they're slightly different. And so it didn't, do like a uniform styling that, it would flip back and forth. But overall, it did a pretty good job. I'm really pleased with it, to the point where I just, cut and paste. I built the application, deploy the code onto the web server, and, got it up and running. So that was pretty cool. I will say that the code is a little bit messy. Honestly, I wouldn't be satisfied with the code it produced if I was putting it up for a PR for my coworkers to review. I think because of the simplicity of this application and website, I was overall very pleased with it. I did ask it to do some refactors and cleanups and organize some things, but one thing that did really impress me was when I started out building this application, explained that I wanted it to be a bio page with different experiences. It did by itself create this really cool experience page. And so this is like the base experience page that all the other pages pull from. I would have put the folders. I would have put a folder here for Amazon Robotic for all my career experiences. And just put these into a separate organizational thing. But what's really cool is it's just loading an experience page. That way the styling and the formatting of all of this is going to be really uniform across. And we see that here, as I hop through this experience, it's pretty clean. And so I thought that was really impressive. It was smart enough to recognize a reusable component and build that. That was awesome. But as I mentioned, the way it did some of the styling things in here, so it has a bunch of style setups here, and it does, you can see the themes as it goes from primary and secondary. And then there are some other issues here where there's like some variances here, and I had to really kind of play with the dark mode requirements here on the home page to get it even to this state. Originally, each of these boxes in these containers, they were like white in the back, and that wasn't a dark mode kind of theme. I did hear that you could probably put in like a screenshot onto the page and then into the windsurf, and it would kind of play with it. I didn't try that for this project initially. I just wanted to kind of get it up and running, but it was pretty good. There are a few still kind of glitches with it. So here I have it pulled up in a mobile view. I didn't actually ask it to make it responsive, but I did want it to, be smart, and I did say it to ask for a modern UI. So you can see here, like some of the skills I put in here, they did fit and they did squeeze, which is nice. But then again, you have this issue with this navigation bar that overlaps and kind of crashes here. You can switch from light to dark mode. Can't really click that Amazon thing. I guess you can in the back. Overall, still looks pretty good. It does, squish the bio. The experience is in here. If you go ahead and click on them, it does do the little blue animation. Pretty good. So overall, I was pretty pleased with this application. Wanted to post it up and share it. Overall, really, really simple application, and most importantly, self-contained. And so I think that was really a proof to the success of like the simplicity of your application and project can do this. So if you wanted to do this yourself, I think it'd be pretty easy to build and get going and get it deployed. I didn't ask for it to do any specific things with like deploying the application. I'm using Hostinger and for my things, and so I did some of that stuff manually. I'm not actually 100% sure what the capabilities are to host it. But yeah, moving on to the next project. So this weekend, I was trying out a few different ideas. So I originally had this idea for my page Modulence and wanted to create some tools. So I thought it'd be really cool for it to build a JSON builder. And then I can use JSON as the input to all my other tools that I wanted. So for example, I did want to build like a build your own resume or build your own, website potentially with just JSON. So if you had all of your experiences and all of your information, you just were able to import that data as JSON, and then you could build your own website. That would be really cool. Or build your own resume. That would be really cool. And then the first page would be a tool to actually help you build the JSON. Turns out I did play around with Gemini, and Gemini can really, really easily import your resume and convert it to the JSON shape as long as you provide it like the schema and your resume. And that was really, really successful. But going back to how I started this project. So, most importantly, you always want to set context when you start a new conversation. Anytime you have a new project, I just recommend just open a brand new chat with the AI, right? Start off with, what you want to do. So, I've been seeing this pattern of using AI to help you prompt AI. Right. And so I was using Gemini 2.5 to help me brainstorm my project and generate those prompts for me. And then I was, putting those prompts into Windsurf and executing on them afterwards. What's really cool here is, just giving it some context of what I want to build. It says, hey, what is the primary goal and core function of the web application you envisioned, right? So it's really smart at like kind of talking through those things. It's kind of like you're brainstorming with a product manager at the company, or they're, the product, you're the product manager and they're the engineer, right? Yeah, and what's really cool is when I told it I want to make a simple tool, for various purposes, it said, hey, can you give me some example of the tools you're envisioning? And what's really cool about this is it's smart enough to understand that, based off of the tools you're going to build on the rest of the page, you're going to need to know that context on like how your rest of the web app is going to function, which I thought was pretty cool. Yeah, it's kind of fun. It's, it's pretty nice and polite and it kind of encouraging. It says, hey, a client-side JSON builder editor is a great starting point, ! Right? It does have that kind of like emotion and excitement, which I thought was really unique and cool, almost kind of humanizing it to some degree, which is interesting. Also, to ask a lot of the good questions. If you're doing a tech interview, you would probably want to ask these questions of like, hey, who are the primary users, right? How does the key value pairs for JSON work, right? These are just clarifying questions that you would typically want to ask, and it's doing a pretty good job at asking those, right? I was always thinking that I wanted to like send very large messages to it initially with like a lot more information. And then, you can see in here the messages that I'm sending and like the responses it's giving me back. I've kind of separated them by this little dash. But it's just interesting that like sometimes, if I give it less, it'll just ask more clarifying questions. I did highlight that here where it says, ask me one question at a time and ask clarifying questions as necessary, right? And then once it has enough information to provide me a list of prompts to generate them for me. So that was a really good way to kind of set the balance. I use the same exact type of thing. I just added a few more clarifications and details for my second project that I started with. And so it was really cool to just kind of brainstorm with the AI all the way through here. Just again, asking a lot of clarifying questions. And, it's interesting, it's always showing the thinking, and you can actually open that up in Gemini and see what it's thinking and all the steps and processes it's following. So that was really cool to watch. I think that itself is just exciting to watch. Kind of like a cool little AI brain function. Anyway, so yeah, it went through all the brainstorm ideas. It created this base conversation summary at the end for me, saying, hey, I want to build this website called Modulence Tools. It's going to be a React, purely front end, because I knew I wanted to have the capabilities only in the front end. I didn't want to set up a back end. I figured that would be more complicated. And so that's what I did for my second application. And I'll talk about some of the problems that I hit there. But yeah, overall, I gave a really good summary. And then, it just, started breaking down the prompts. This is really cool. It gave me all the prompts step by step in all the components and building them. And let's say I didn't want to build the JSON builder and I wanted to just build a resume builder, I could have just done that. So that overall worked out pretty good. I wanted to kind of touch on some of the other things that were happening with the build, but I was definitely having problems in the JSON builder. The UI was definitely very complicated and crashing. There's already a pretty cool JSON builder web app already out there that does this, and the tool that I was building was just not coming any close. So I decided to kind of scrap that JSON builder project and move on to the resume builder project, assuming that I can get Gemini to just generate the JSON for me. And it turns out that was actually really, really good. Once I created my base schema and I sent that schema to Gemini and I gave it my resume, it was able to generate that for me, and that was phenomenal. And so once I had that, I was able to just kind of move on to building the resume builder. What's interesting is it mentioned that PDF generation can be complicated to do on the server side or client side, and it recommended that I would have a backend, even a small server side thing where PDF generation would be really good, which is really good to know because I didn't know that there's no good libraries for PDF generation on the client side. There are some JavaScript things, but it mentioned that they weren't so great. And so it was pretty interesting to see and get that recommendation. And so I ended up just settling on like a markdown creation for the page. And yeah, it made a pretty good, simple markdown page for that application. So again, pretty good at successfully building a simple kind of, standalone client side kind of, single page application. It's got some good organizational things when it comes to like setting up your tabs and stuff. But let's get into the more complicated project. So most recently, I was working on this weekend a travel planner tool. The idea of this tool was to help people build itineraries. I like to travel a lot, and so I would actually use this tool myself. My friends and family members also travel a lot, and so it'd be really great to like kind of just build this tool that we would all use, and then potentially some of you would use it as well. And so going on to that, again, I had the same kind of prompt as you're an AI expert. I was using Gemini again here, asked for the clarifying questions, and it says to me providing guidance on where to deploy the front end and back end. So this was interesting. I wanted to see, if it could web search and then tell me the best places to deploy a database, a backend server, and if it knew like some cheap options, right? I could obviously easily just go and use all of AWS or all of Google's tools. But I wanted to see if it could, give me recommendations. It didn't end up recommending Render, and so I started using Render to set up my database and my backend server, which was pretty cool. But yeah, acting as an expert guide, it started going through the thing. What's really cool here is as I went through the brainstorm, it made me realize that, when it asked this question, I realized that my basic application that I wanted to start with was actually too complicated, and that helped me recognize that, right? So it asked me, how does the user specify like the sequence of cities and the number of days they want to spend in each of the city? And that made me realize that, hey, this is getting quite complicated for the start of the project, right? And I think that was really cool. It's a really good way to kind of recognize that your project scope is too big. And I did that just by asking these clarifying questions, and I realized I was going down a rabbit hole. So I asked it to step back, go back to a simpler solution here, and then move forward from there. So we revised the scope. It was able to follow along. I asked it to like, hey, start from the beginning, based off of the tool we want to build, and simplify the scope such that if the user just inserts a bunch of, attractions, it would simply create like a travel plan of like start here, go here, go here, go here, and it would kind of solve the transportation and the time spent per day, and then tell you which city or area neighborhood you'd be staying in, and then potentially make some recommendations for hotels and restaurants in that area depending on what time of day and where you are. And so that's kind of the gist of this project that I wanted to build. And just asking more clarifying questions, getting more details, overall has been pretty helpful in doing that. And then we get to the point where it's going to give you prompts for AI code generation. This time around, it was interesting. It organized the things a little bit differently. It gave me a lot of these large prompts, which I thought was actually more detrimental. This project, as you can tell, is definitely way more complicated in scope and features. There's way more REST endpoints. There's a front end and back end. There's a database to this. And it was giving me these very large chunks. And so I wanted to kind of test limits here. I've had somewhat success in the past 2 basic applications at the code that the Windsurf were generating. It wasn't the cleanest or the best organized, or it still had some errors, but it was still functional. So I wanted to test out these large chunks. And overall, just made me quickly realize that it is probably best to break this down in the size of like a typical like 1 story point ticket. These chunks, it was creating a lot of these things. One of the biggest disconnects I had, I can pull up the code here, and then I've been trying to fix recently, was it was not at all matching the API requests and responses. And actually, I'm still having that problem. So here you can see we're in the backend code here. I was like, all right, well, let's generate Swagger docs. So I got it to import Swagger, generate those API docs. I pulled in the JSON from the Swagger. We can go over to the front end here. And then see, I imported the whole Swagger JSON here, and I was like, hey, fix all of the input errors that we have. Our request parameters, they do not match the schema at all. I was having the application crash on an issue where the new itinerary, that page, was just asking originally for only the trip name. It didn't have start date and end date. And so, my basic request in the back end, the schema that I generated there, did require that component in the itineraries. And so, all those fields and those parameters, it was not matching them up. And what's interesting is you can see here trip name, start date, attractions list. And then right now, even today, if you go back to the front end, you can see here that it is missing a list of attractions. There's no place to input that in the UI. And so this is kind of the problem today, where, Gemini was able to understand the concept of the front end and the back end, the APIs and everything. But when it came to the prompts and the components to generate, it just did not match those components. And so obviously this is the point where, you can decide whether you want to start going into the code and adding these things yourself, or you can, kind of ask the AI to generate that code for you. I think if you reduce the size of your request, right? Go to just one page, one API, one form, and just say, hey, explicitly add an input for this, add an input for this, add an input for this. That would be a way to kind of move forward from there. Most importantly, I did want to use AI to generate the backend for this project as well. So don't forget to go to either Gemini and get an AI key there, or whatever your preferred AI tool is. This is not only a project that I was trying to combine vibe coding to build the application, but also to use AI to provide data to help plan the itinerary, right? I haven't gone to that point yet. Hopefully in the next iteration of this blog entry, we'll get a lot further along. I'm not 100% sure if I want to continue in this code base. What's really cool about this is, if you don't like the code that it's generated, or it's too messy, or you feel like you're too far away from where you want to be, you can just probably go start spinning up a new code base. I am seeing this interesting issue with Windsurf where it says you're running low on credits, but it really hasn't stopped me from sending prompts yet. I imagine Windsurf will be fixing that shortly. Once that hits, I'm going to switch to Pro. Obviously, once you get into the Pro models and you start running out of those credits, you want to be really careful, because just every time you hit enter in here, it's going to burn a credit, and you're going to run out of credits probably pretty quick, way quicker than you think. and especially if you decide to start a project from scratch because you don't like where your code base ended up, that's going to be another problem as well. So what do I think is going to be the path forward? So I tried a few things here. If I go over to the Gemini UI here, I did try to also ask it to generate like a Firebase level of documentation because I wanted to try to use Firebase Studio. And so I was playing around with that, and this was also creating a new application for me in here. And what's interesting about Firebase Studio is it just keeps building and doing the things, and it's supposed to be building the front end and back end and database and user authentication, everything for you. As you can see clearly, this page isn't working for me. I'm having a lot of issues with the sign-up requests, firewalls. One of the things that I was saying I was missing was like the Firebase API, and I was like, well, you're Firebase, right? Why can't you just automatically generate an API key for me and put it in there? And it seems to be struggling at that point. I need to kind of go back to this and pick up where I left off. But as you can see here, we're trying out a few different tools with Firebase Studio to try to generate this application. It'd be really cool to build this app on the phone as a mobile app, so I can give this to friends and family and just say, they can start planning their itinerary from their phone, and they don't need to log into a website. So that would have been pretty cool. But going back to the brainstorming here, as you can see here, it was pretty good at giving a lot of the detail. I think the next step for me in the next iteration of projects that I do, or whether I restart this project, I want to break it down to like a chunk ticket level. So I wonder if I'm going to try out with Gemini and see if, hey, what can it do with breaking down ticket level components? Even if you could do this and just, have a brainstorm a project with you and break down tickets, I think that would be a really good use case for product managers in the software industry. And I think overall it would be really useful for them to kind of get some more technical breakdowns that would, kind of bridge the gap between product and engineering folks. I think AI did a really good job of asking those detailed questions and putting together this list of information here for me. And that would be a really good kind of handoff point to engineering. I think in the enterprise world, I think this has a really good application use for that case. Most importantly, you do want to read through and edit and verify all of these things. What I've been trying to do is try to be as little hands-in what the AI does, and even though I don't necessarily agree with some of the prompts or some of the components, I feel like it's going to error out. I've been trying to just to test the limitations of it, and I definitely feel like I've hit the end of that. I'm also having issues kind of in the front end and the back end where like security, I asked it for it to be very secure, set up so that, when I have a production and a dev config, production URLs are whitelisted to my front end servers. And so no one can, set up a cross-site hack or anything like that. And so, only the requests that can be made to the backend are from my front-end server that I specify. And then I ran into some interesting issues where, like, the Swagger docs, I couldn't access them in my dev. Another problem I hit with the front end was, even though it had configured this front-end or back-end URL in here in the environment here, so even though my backend is running on localhost 8080, in the code I actually had to go and find instances of the API calling the wrong endpoints. Both in the login page, there was errors because it was setting the wrong values and overriding whatever the URL was. So it was pointing to the front end server instead of the back end server. And the same thing was happening in the itinerary page. I haven't gotten to the point of loading a public itinerary yet because I can't create an itinerary because that's crashing. But I expect that error to kind of be throughout. So even though I did say, hey, this is my development config, this is the URL for my backend requests, it's still having problems where it's written a bunch of custom code that's kind of, not hitting that exact base URL. And so this is it's interesting because, when you're engineering work, you probably won't run into this error because you'll consciously write the code to make sure that it's using this as environment variable, and then you wouldn't have this issue. But this does seem to be an issue with vibe coding where it writes a lot of custom code in a bunch of areas and it doesn't recognize necessarily where to pull values from. And that results in these types of errors. And so I feel like, when you're doing vibe coding, you spend a lot of time, kind of talking to the AI, giving it requirements, and then obviously bug bashing. I see the point where potentially we get to the state where product is, generating code based off of their requirements, and then engineers probably just spend time doing code reviews and fixing bugs and cleaning up some things. That very much well could be a potential future state. I don't think this is even remotely close to that yet at the enterprise level. One thing I want to clarify that I haven't been doing on these projects is because these are standalone home projects, we're not really testing the benefits of the UI, right? In order, if I was working on this at an enterprise level, I probably wouldn't be asking it to generate a lot of code. I'd just be asking it to kind of auto-complete a lot of the things that I wanted to do, potentially in line with the code. And I feel like that would be much simpler and better because I can choose, and then I can prevent it from adding unnecessary or bad code that I don't want. I think that's the way to kind of move forward with enterprise use of everything so far. Obviously, that could change. Hopefully, these large language models will kind of learn and adapt and be better at organizing large chunks of information. Honestly, I think this is kind of the same problem that an engineer would have, where if they're in their mind, they're trying to keep track of tons of API endpoints, tons of backend, tons of security. It's just going to be messy. If you ask someone to code really, really fast, they're probably not going to remove redundant code or custom code sometimes, just depending on how they code. But when you try to move fast, I think that's what happens. And honestly, we're seeing that same level of problem with AI today. So yeah, overall, I'm really, really impressed. I want to test out probably a new happy medium next, where I have some code that's a more complicated single page application that maybe works through different tools and other things. See how that goes. And then in the next time I try to do a full stack application, what I think I want to do is, maybe when I revisit either this travel planner or start with something a little bit simpler, I want to kind of chunk out the tickets as you would in an enterprise and see how that goes. I feel like that would be a lot better. I think it's interesting to see that it struggles with general broad things, and engineers struggle with that day to day too. So if instead, just focus on, hey, build this page, it's going to do XYZ things, build this, insert and build these requests to the back end. Make sure to generate those APIs upfront. As you know, in engineering, you want the APIs before you start generating the front end. Request, just so you know what form fields you want, what the response data is going to look like, right? So making sure, I think you really want to take a typical engineering approach to vibe coding. So yeah, I think it's going to be important to slow down, work on these chunks. Now, one thing I'd be interested to see is if I asked Gemini to generate those chunks and those tickets, I wonder how that would go, right? I think that'd be a really next thought experiment. So I think that's what I'm going to do next. And so, yeah, stay tuned for my next update. Hopefully this video didn't go too long. I know it's kind of a rant, and hopefully you found some things important, and definitely leave some comments on the other topics you'd like to talk about and hear me speak about. But thanks for watching.